The first traces go all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome. Some of their games, like Feininda or Harpastum, featured a leather ball filled with wool that involved a great deal of strength and agility. With tackling and sporadic sprinting, broken bones happened all the time. From this then came a medieval game called mob ball. Rules varied from town to town, but usually there seemed to be hardly any rules, just a ball and violence. Over the course of time, clubs began to develop in Europe, and people started playing all forms of mob ball, some more civilized than others. Eventually, there was order brought to this game. During a set of meetings in London in 1863, a committee was put in place to create an official set of rules to give some sort of regulation. From these meetings, two games were created: a more physical game that used your hands, and a more skillful game that used your feet. Both of these games had been established, but in America, it was a different story. By the 19th century, Americans had been sort of playing by their own rules depending on which college campus you were at. Towards the end of the 1860s, the Civil War had ended, and universities began to experiment with making official rules. On November 6, 1869, Rutgers and Princeton, based on the rules that Princeton had created 2 years prior, would compete in what has become known as the first college football game ever played. The NCAA recognizes this as true, and Rutgers has a statue that says it's the birthplace of college football.
American football is as cherished a pastime as it gets, but when you look back at its roots, it used to look a whole lot like the other football. You know, the one where you actually use your foot. The first collegiate football game was played in 1869 between Rutgers and Princeton. The players used a round ball, but it was more about what they didn't use: their hands. The game used the structure of soccer, but with the physicality of rugby. 25-man sides had scrums, almost continuous play, and no substitutions. It was most definitely tougher than the football you see today, but not nearly as much fun to watch. It was pretty much a disorganized pile, pushing each other back and forth until a team reached 6 goals.
When would football become recognizable to us? 1874, Harvard would play against Canadian University McGill. McGill had agreed to come to Boston if they would play by their Canadian rules. It was an emphasis on rugby. Harvard took a liking to this. They would challenge Yale to a game a year later, and even though Yale would lose, they were captivated by rugby. They put an emphasis on learning the nuances and beat Harvard the following year. One of Yale's team members in 1876, Walter Camp, decided, hey, this is a cool game and all, but I have a few ideas that can make it better.
Walter Camp aggressively proposed new rules in the early 1880s that the real bones of American football came to be, and lobbied to take the ball off the ground. Among his contributions were the addition of a quarterback, first downs, and 11-man teams. He also added blocking, which was illegal in rugby. These rules resulted in new strategies, especially the emergence of mass formation plays. Think flying V formations where you're plowing into and hopefully through the other team. While totally effective, these plays were also extremely dangerous, for obvious reasons. After 19 people died in 1906 alone, Teddy Roosevelt called for a complete overhaul of the rules. This call led to the single most important advancement in shaping the game of football: the legalization of the forward pass. Previously, only lateral passing was allowed, and this opened the game up immediately, making it more exciting and safer at the same time. 1920 brought the formation of the NFL, originally called the APFA, and a bunch of new rules, including legalizing the forward pass from anywhere, as it was previously only allowed 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage. The NFL also added hash marks so that every play began in the middle of the field, instead of where the last one ended.
The year is 1919. The war had just ended, and people in America were looking for something to do. Meanwhile, in Wisconsin, George Calhoun and Curly Lambeau, both having played high school football years prior, happened to run into each other one day and got to talking. Lambeau mentioned how he went on to play college football at Notre Dame, but had to drop out due to a severe case of tonsillitis. During the conversation, he mentioned how he still wanted to play. Calhoun then said, well, what if we start a football team? Lambeau loved the idea. Later on, he would persuade his employer, the Indian Packing Company, to sponsor the team. They would put down $500 for equipment and uniforms. Lambeau wanted to call the team the Green Bay Indians to show respect to his employer for purchasing the uniforms for the team. That's when his girlfriend said, "Why don't you just call them the Green Bay Packers?" From that moment on, it was official. The legacy was born. American football has such a compelling story. When this happened, the NFL didn't exist yet. In fact, pro football at the time was just sort of local clubs getting together and having a little scrimmage. Here's a pretty crazy story. When the Packers started playing games, they didn't have a fence around the field, so they didn't charge admission. Instead, they would pass around a hat amongst the crowd, kind of like what a church would do. The players on the team would split the pot after the season. They each made $16.50. It wasn't until the following year, 1920, when the NFL would officially become a thing. The first recognized NFL game ever took place on October 3rd, 1920 in Dayton, Ohio. It was witnessed by 4,000 people who each paid $1.75 to attend the game. It was played between two teams who didn't exist by the 1930s. Pro football had humble beginnings.
The game was largely unchanged until the 1970s, when the field goal after a touchdown was reduced to a single point. For the next 20 years, the NFL tweaked the rules in order to make things safer, including outlawing face masks, chop blocks, and hands to the face, as well as instituting the play clock. At first at 30 seconds, then 45, and finally to the 40 seconds it is today. The next major shift in rules was in the 90s, when the two-point conversion was introduced, instant replay, and the challenge system. The 2000s left the major rules mostly unchanged, besides the tuck rule, made infamous when Tom Brady appeared to lose a critical fumble in a playoff game against the Raiders. The rule was abolished in 2013, but as for the 2010s, we've seen some shifting in kickoff and overtime rules, but the most significant shift came just this year, when we finally got our insane touchdown celebrations back.
By the age of 33, Camp had become known as the father of American football. By the time he passed away in 1925, the game had evolved into a professional sport that had swept the nation. A game that he probably had no idea how big it would become.
Walter Camp would be proud. Probably.